What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Big Five Pod, episode number 95. Wow, that's crazy. But here we are. I'm, of course, your co-host, Kyle Morello, co-host Jake Copestick with me. And once again, we have a very special guest from Ivy Hoops Online. We have Ian Wenik covering the Ivy League, specifically Penn as well. Ian, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. And after me, it's all downhill from here.
I wouldn't say all that. Wouldn't say all that. We're very excited to talk Ivy League hoops. First and foremost, you actually put out a Q&A earlier today on this recording on October 15th with Steve Donahue, the coach of Penn. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about that first before we take into the overarching themes of the Ivy League this year. How was that? What did some of the things you guys talked about? And just kind of go over everything that Steve had to say about the upcoming season because it's going to be hopefully an exciting one for Penn.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it went in a direction that I honestly didn't expect. So I kind of went into the interview expecting that we were going to talk a lot about spacing, efficiency ball, and what Steve really kind of buckled in on, besides talking about the obvious elephant in the room, which was the struggles on defense, was that he really spent an extended amount of time talking about how he wants the team to play bigger and that they're going to start using more of a two big lineup this year. And so that opened the door for some unique lines of questioning. I'm sure that we can get into how that kind of lineup is going to function, what's that going to mean for some of the big returnees, where the new transfers are going to fit in. But it was definitely an adjustment to offensive philosophy and lineup construction that I wasn't expecting. But the more that I think about it, the more it does kind of make sense.
Yeah.
So, Ian, I want to throw this at you because I read it today and it was really good stuff. And definitely want to give you a plug on Ivy Hoops Online and the work you're doing there. But as good of a passing big man as Nick Spinoso is, he's one of the best in the country at the center position as far as being a passer and a facilitator. And it's easy to look at his numbers and watch him play and be like, hey, they should do more of that. They should play through him more. But you talk about the lineup construction and wanting to play bigger, and it actually seems like Coach wants to take the ball out of his hands a little bit more and alleviate all the facilitation that needs to go on through him. So when it comes to playing with two bigs or maybe taking some of the passing duties away from Nick Spinoso, like what is that going to look like for Penn this year?
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned Nick because I really think in many ways he's going to be the most important player on the team this year. And I really expected he was going to function kind of how AJ Broder used to function, how Nick functioned a lot of time when Jordan Dingle was still around, or last year when Clark Slack was still around, where he'd be kind of operating at almost a five-out set at the top, operating like a point forward, and then occasionally you'd post him up. And I think when you watch Nick play, I mean, he's so good at making a lot of these high degree of difficulty passes. Of Jim Root from Three Man Weave, I mean, he compared him to DJ Burns, which I think that's a good compliment. I think that Nick is a little bit more athletic than DJ Burns was. He has more verticality, but it's very similar in how they're both very good at passing out of double teams, working well off single coverage in the post. And Steve said explicitly that a lot of times he felt like the offense was putting Nick in a position where he was being forced to make a lot of plays for other people, and that put him in a position where his turnover rate was high. And I mean, that's the main issue with Nick. If you look at his game on the offensive end, is that, he's been playing for 3 years, but he's never had an offensive KenPom rating above that break-even mark of 100. I mean, he peaked at 98 last year, which matched his freshman year, and that's all a direct function of the turnover rate, which granted was at a career low last year, but it was still 22.5%. And so it seems like what Steve was thinking is that you'll have Dylan Williams, the transfer point guard coming from Triton, that he's going to be the primary initiator of offense. And that means you're going to have Nick operating more as a duck-in guy, as a finisher, as opposed to him being the primary ball handler. I also think that having a second big might take some pressure off Nick on the defensive end because, look, he's a very good rim protector. He is top 50 in the country by KenPom in defensive rebound rate. He was top 220 in block rate. He's a very good rim protector, but he's not the most mobile guy. He's not really a perimeter defender. And I think if you watch the game against Princeton last year, Princeton really kind of targeted and exploited him because they'd run these matchups so that Nick would be forced to cover a stretch like Zach Martini, who, he couldn't cover him on the perimeter. So you'd see the ball rotate 2, 3 times, and you'd have Martini in the corner and Nick just trying to scramble to close out. Like, that's not his game. So having a second big might take some of that pressure of covering those kinds of stretch fours and fives off of him.
So I have one more before I want to kick you back over to Kyle. Kyle, we can just popcorn here. So you bring up Dylan Williams, who's coming in from the JUCO ranks in Triton, who I believe made the JUCO Final Four. They were very, very good last year. So with him coming in, hopefully a healthy season for Sam Brown, who was good. Who was good at times when he was in there. He just was dealing with some injuries and had an injury in the offseason he was dealing with. What does the point guard spot look like? Because gone are the days of Jordan Dingle and Clark Slackert now. So now that we're going to have like a passing of the torch almost with a transfer, with Sam Brown moving into his sophomore year, when Steve Donahue says, let's keep it in the playmakers' hands now, what do you think that looks like from a rotational standpoint with Dylan Williams coming in? But also, they have a bunch of guys coming back as well. George Smith is going to return as well. AJ Levin, Alex Masong, they have some freshmen here as well. Like, it's a really big roster. There's a lot of people on it. But who do you think are going to be the people with the ball in their hands the most that could ultimately be the starting two guards on this team?
I mean, I really think that if you're talking about who's going to be the primary initiator of offense, I think that the keys are going to be in Jalen Williams' hands. I mean, he chose Penn. He had 15, 16 other D1 offers coming out of the portal, and he chose Penn. And I'm sure he didn't choose Penn. I mean, the degree I'm sure helps, but you don't choose Penn over 15 to 16 others if you're not getting some sort of expectation of playing time, having a big role in the offense. And look, I mean, if you look at his stats, he averaged nearly, I think, 40% from three. I think he had about 2 steals per game. Now, I think that one limitation might be height, relatively speaking. I mean, I think he stands about 5'11". So that might be an issue regarding a guy like, let's say, Xavier Lee, who will have like 4 inches on him. But it seems like he's a good distributor facilitator. I watched a lot of his tape. He's really good at playing in transition. He had some really nice dribble moves to set himself up, a nice in and out, almost kind of like Dingle to set himself up for nice, good step back three look. So I feel like he's going to be the one who has the keys to the offense as the one. And for the two, I mean, I feel like it's going to be Sam Brown. I think back to what Steve told me last week, which was he wants Sam to be off the ball, operating as what he calls, I'm quoting directly, a simple playmaker. And so what does that mean? I think that means he's going to be cutting off the ball. I think it's going to be using screens to set himself up for catch and shoot threes. And so look, Sam was a top 100 guy, 82nd to be exact, in 3-point shooting percentage against D1 opponents. He shot 42.2%. I'm looking at his numbers on Torvik right now. 87%, almost 88% of his threes were assisted off catch and shoots. And there were a couple of times where like you could see guys sagging off at him. He would dribble into wide open NBA range threes, but his game is going to be, I think, as a finisher and an off ball scorer as opposed to being a primary initiator of offense. And you could see in those early stages of Ivy play when Clark Slacker went down and there was no real primary ball handler that Sam kind of struggled at times as the primary initiator of offense. That's not a knock on him. I'm sure that's going to develop in time, but right now it seems like he's best suited as kind of the off-ball two-guard finisher.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely makes sense. So we mentioned obviously a few of the names that either are coming back. You mentioned Dylan Williams, the transfer. Um, but there's also a lot of new names on this roster. There's been a lot of turnover from the last couple of years at least. What are a couple names that you can give out that you think are going to have a big impact this year that maybe Penn fans and Ivy League fans aren't necessarily familiar with at this point in time?
I mean, for me, I really think the big name is going to be Ethan Roberts, who is a transfer with a pretty interesting backstory. So for context, he was the Patriot League Freshman of the Year when he was at Army in 22-23. He hit the portal because with the service academies, you can transfer your first year without having to do your 5 years of service. And he went to Drake, good team, 2 years straight in the NCAA tournament. He got a mystery injury last year, forced him to redshirt, and then he hit the portal again after Darian DeVries took the West Virginia job. And so he's a guy where if he played last year, he probably would have numbers and get NIL money too big for Penn to realistically compete. But I mean, if you look at his stats, I mean, I'm pulling up his numbers from freshman year. As a freshman, he was 113.4 offensive rating on KenPom. That's 401st in the country. 40% three-point shooter, 54% from two, 85% free throw shooter. And the guy's 6'5". He's a good three guy. He has length. So he seems like a guy you can guard multiple positions, average double figures, shoot, finish, drive. I mean, Steve said that Ethan might be the best player on the team just heading into the season. So I view him, I mean, three-man we've put him as a preseason second team All Ivy for a good reason. And I think that, setting the freshmen side in the league, I think that you can make a case that he'll be the newcomer of the league, newcomer of the year in the Ivy League, and that he could easily average 12 to 15 points per game.
I can absolutely see it. I can absolutely see it. One more quote before I throw it back to you. There's one more player I got to talk about. He's just probably my favorite player on the team. He's gritty. He doesn't do a whole lot numbers wise, but you just love to see him out there, and that's George Smith. I mean, I don't know about you, but I love watching George Smith play basketball. And this is now our third season covering the Big Five. He's always been one of the more fun players. He's just gritty. He gets out there, he defends. You know, he's just one of those players that you want on your team, and the other people on the other teams don't want to see. So what can you tell me about George Smith this year, his expectations, and I know you talked to Coach recently, his expectations for George Smith heading into the year.
So George didn't actually come up in the conversation directly. Him or Cam Frolich was kind of an oversight on my part, frankly. But it's interesting with George because I've always viewed him as like a really interesting kind of prototypical 3 and D guy. I was kind of surprised, and again, this could just be a sample size thing, at the way that his shooting numbers regressed last season. I mean, he was 48% from three as a sophomore. He was second in the whole Ivy League in conference play in three-point shooting, and he shot 26.3% from deep, and it took his Ken Palm offensive rating below that 100 point per possession break even barrier. So yeah, like the prototype, the framework, like he's a good perimeter defender. He clearly fits his rotational piece, but there's what these terms can mean, like with Robert and Michael Zanoni, who came in from Mercer, another kind of 3-4 wing type with good outside shooting. There's definitely going to be a lot more competition for minutes. And so maybe it's a situation where George isn't starting day one the way in which he had a lot of starts down the stretch last season. And maybe he's more kind of a bench rotational piece, but I don't want to assume. And again, like he has a lot of plus traits, plus factors, I think will still give him a role on this team.
He's got a lot of experience as well. I believe he's going into his senior year now, which seems like it's flown by because I remember his first season, and you're exactly right, both of you. Like what got him on the court was he was putting his body on the line on defense. Very good at defending on the ball. Like that's what was getting him his minutes his freshman year. Um, I want to ask you though, I want to kick it to the freshmen a little bit here because there's a lot of guys on this roster. And I know Ed Holland left the team, but believe this roster is at 15 or 16 now, even with Ed Holland's departure. So it's a really big team. And last year, seldom sans a Sam Brown when he was in there, with injuries, and then Tyler Perkins, we didn't see too much of a Nicholas Polanowski or an Augie Gerhardt. So now that there's a brand new class coming in, and there's a couple local guys, you have AJ Levin from the Chicago area, you have Alex Masong from New Jersey. Do you think any of these freshmen can fit in the rotation from day one? I know it's not really an Ivy League thing because there's so much minutes returning every year in this league. This is the one league where there's not really the roster turnover that you see in other conferences. But do you think any of the freshmen might be able to break the rotation this year?
So the two names that Steve mentioned specifically were AJ Levine, coming from the Chicagoland area, and Michelangelo Berti, who was one of the best big men in the entire state of New Jersey, playing out of Morris Catholic, a 6'10" big man from Italy. And so it seems like those two guys are first in line. Steve described AJ as the best on-ball defender on the team right now, which is definitely high praise. I think that George is on the team. And so last year, I mean, this just shows how poisoned my brain is. When the team was pretty much toast down the stretch, I would watch AJ Levine's high school playoff games because they'd all be streamed for free on YouTube. And there was this stretch, I think it was the sectional semifinals, where he's carrying his team back. He's got a couple of D1 recruits on the roster. He rolls his ankle really, really badly midway through the fourth quarter, goes back in, he gets taped up, iced up, clearly playing on adrenaline. He comes back in and he drains this incredible step back three on one good foot that should have won the game for his team. They gave up a true buzzer beater and lost, but I was thinking, wow, that reminds me of like a Darnell Foreman who would lay his body on the line for the team, or Reese McMullen, who played through, I think, what might have been a separated dislocated shoulder against Harvard, trying to strip the ball from Malik Mack. Smith, who played with the mask on his face for half the season after breaking his nose. So he clearly has that toughness that the coaching staff likes. So I see why he has a like he's going to have a role. And O'Barity, I mean, if you look at his numbers, I mean, he had some incredible like 30 and 20 games playing for Morris Catholic. I see him having a decent role right as the star as a kind of a reserve big man. And the question you mentioned, Augie, I mean, he might get first crack as that second big man alongside Nick. It's an open question. And Polanowski, he's someone I think is going to be again in the battle for those wing rotational minutes. His playing style and profile again fairly similar to what Roberts has, to what Zanoni has, and so it's tough for me to kind of project or guarantee what kind of role he'll have in the outset, but you see the skill set. These 3-and-D guys that have length, they should be able to help on the defensive end.
And I want to ask you about that before I kick you back over to Kyle, because it was a big point of emphasis in your Q&A with Steve was on the defensive end. They were not very good last year, not at all by really any metric. And when you can bring in a guy like AJ Levin, that defense will probably get him on the floor right away. But I think it was interesting because you talked a lot of tactics with them, which was really, really insightful in your Q&A. But defensively, how does how does Penn get the defense fixed from last year? They didn't make the Ivy League playoff, believe for the first time since the inception of it. Like, how do they get the defense back to try and get back into the Ivy League playoffs?
And so the main thing that I really touched on with Steve was the zone rate, which I think they were forced into based on the personnel. And so I'll borrow a little bit from Jim Root, three-man weave. And his main critique of the team is that he really thinks that the roster, notwithstanding the transfers, had really, really, really poor foot speed. And that was what led to a lot of the struggles with rotation out to secondary shooters. And look, I mean, the zone, this team was bottom 20 in the country in opposing three-point rate allowed. And look, the zone, basically any 2-3 zone, you're going to open yourself up to giving up a ton of threes. When you're going up against a team like Princeton that can set the nets on fire, I mean, you're asking to get burnt. You're asking to get burned with the zone. And so I think the zone was kind of a little bit of an attempt to compensate for maybe that relative lack of foot speed, lack of athleticism. But I think the main way to change the defense is you have to have a guy, again, kind of at the head of the snake, right? Like if it's Levine, if it's Dylan Williams, if you have a point guard who can defend at the top of the defense, maybe pick up full court pressure, I mean, that's going to set the tone for everything. And look, if you have a second big, you can have someone who can come in and help, and maybe you're not exposing Nick Spinoza to as much foul trouble as him to contest everything at the rim. So I think you're going to need the point guard position to really lead the turnaround on the defensive end. And then after that, it's just hoping that some of these guys like a Robert, Zanoni, that they're fully healthy and that they have the lateral quickness they can help deal with these guys.
And the zone's a good point. Kyle, real quick, I just want to step in. The zone is a good point because that won them the Villanova game. They sat in the 2-3 zone, and like Villanova had they had the athletes, the length maybe the Penn didn't have last year. And to counteract that, they slowed them down. They made them think more. They didn't allow them to blow by them and really get into the paint. They played that zone, and they slowed them down and ended up winning. So I thought that was like one of the more interesting points was the zone that you talked about, because like maybe they should go to it a little more. It certainly worked against Villanova when they decided to play them.
And the zone definitely worked as a changeup because you could tell in the moment it confused Nova. They dared Nova to shoot, and guys just struggled with it. I mean, I've got the box score up. I mean, Eric Dixon did fine. Justin Moore did okay, but TJ Bamba 0 for 4, Mark Armstrong 0 for 2, Longino 1 for 4, Brendan Housen 1 for 5. They dared Nova secondary shooters to shoot, and they got a little lucky, but it worked. Like they clearly weren't expecting it, and Nova didn't adjust. And that's both credit to Penn and credit to Coach Donahue, and also a little bit of an indictment of Kyle Neptune, which I'm sure is a topic you guys have touched on and will touch on it, I'm sure, at different points during the season. So the zone, I think, works as a changeup. But if you look, and again, this is credit to three-man weave, 22-23, Penn ran the zone at 1.6%. Last year, it was 18.9%. If you're running the zone more in the 5 to 10% range, I think it makes sense as a changeup. But if you're running 1 out of every 5 possessions in the zone, I think that you open yourself up to trouble giving up open outside shots.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that ended up being kind of what Villanova's season looked like, where they just couldn't hit three-pointers. That was kind of, they took a lot. They didn't hit as many as they would have liked to. So I guess you could say Penn trendsetters last year. So that's that. Anyway, we were talking about the Ivy League and not just Penn. So why don't we go into more of an Ivy League kind of general discussion here? So in the Ivy League preseason poll, Penn was picked seventh out of eighth, only ahead of Dartmouth. However, on Ken Palm, I'm looking at it right now, they're sitting at fourth behind Princeton, Yale, and Cornell. So a little bit projections all over the place. I know some people obviously are higher on them than others. Where do you stand on Penn going into the year in terms of the Ivy League as a whole?
I'm definitely much more in the camp of aligning with Haslametrics, a Ken Palm, which has Penn in that third, fourth, fifth range. I think that this team, as constructed right now, has the talent, especially on the offensive end, that they should contend for an Ivy League tournament spot. And look, I think as Brown proved last year, all you have to do is just get in. You get in, anything can happen. You just need one or two good days, and anything can happen. But I think what opens the door for Penn is, and we can touch on it a little bit. Brown lost arguably their best returning player in Nana Owusu-Nane. I mean, it's just tough to have an almost season-ruining injury before the season even starts. I think a lot of the metrics that have Cornell in the third spot are definitely kind of based on this belief in John Jakes, the new coach, kind of keeping the Brian Earl system going. And there are some solid contributors from that team. Guy Ragland sticking around, A.K. Okereke sticking around, but Cornell still lost a significant amount of talent and some guys with some extreme plus traits like a Chris Manning, who was one of the best ball stealers in the entire country. Isaiah Gray, another big loss. Sean Hansen. So Cornell, as talented as they are and as strong a system they have a lot of talent to replace. Me, I kind of see the main contenders for that 3-4 spot. I mean, I view it as kind of a car crash between Penn, I think Columbia, which has a lot of talent, just hasn't put it together yet, but is the beneficiary of a lot of lineup consistency and returning minutes. I think Harvard to an extent. I think Brown, maybe if they get some new front court players. And then you can I think Cornell in there too. I think you're going to see maybe two out of the four of Penn, Cornell, Columbia, Brown get the 3-4 spot.
Okay, okay, fair enough. Obviously, the gold standard in the Ivy League the last few years has been Princeton and Yale. Especially Princeton, just, obviously their Sweet 16 run a couple years ago and whatnot. How do you think Penn, obviously they're going to be competing for that 3 and 4 spot, as you just said, but there's always something to be said about how they measure up against the best in the league. So how do you think Penn measures up against the best in the league this year in Princeton and Yale?
So this is a very sad stat, but it's one I cite all the time. The last time that Penn beat Princeton, Patrick Mahomes had one start as an NFL quarterback. It
Oh,
was the
geez.
meaningless Week 17 game against the Broncos in the last week of the
I
27th.
think Cope might be a little familiar with that one. The Broncos fan. So, yeah,
Sad.
yeah.
I mean, it's been a long time. And look, I mean, there have been some games where Mitch Henderson has frankly outcoached Steve Donnie, frankly outcoached Steve. There have been some games where Penn should have won, but they threw it away, like the last regular season game last year. There were some games where you could argue that maybe the refing flipped things, but still should have probably had the game put away earlier. Think about the Ivy tournament 2 years ago. So it's tough because look, Princeton's starting five, I think it's strong enough that you can see this team feasibly having a path to an at-large berth in the NCAA tournament. I mean, they have a guy, Xavier Lee, who is probably going to get drafted after this year. I mean, he had, I think, chances to go late second this year, but chose to stick around for another year to boost his draft stock. And more credit to him. Caden Pierce, another guy who has a shot at making the league. Princeton's issue, we can dive into this a little bit later, is that I just think that they're a little bit thin. And Yale, I mean, look, Yale returns, I think, the best defensive player in the entire Ivy League in Bez Mbang. But they have similar front court questions too to Brown with Danny Wolf leaving. I mean, again, that's another guy who has NBA upside. He wanted to go to his dream school, which was go to Michigan, and he hit the portal. Now, Yale has a guy in Samson Allerton, I think can kind of step in instantly and maybe supplant some of what Wolf did, at least from a scoring perspective. But Yale clearly is going to have to change some things in their system to adjust. But still, they're returning some talented Mbang and John Poulikitis that played critical roles in that NCAA tournament victory over Auburn. So I view Princeton as like a half notch above Yale, and then Yale and Princeton combined maybe a full notch over the rest of the league.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with you. I think it's the top two. I think if I was filling out my standings right now, I have three spots solidified. It's Princeton 1, Yale 2, and then Dartmouth last at number 8. That
Oh
would be,
man.
and then you could fill in the other 5. So I want to ask you about like the loss of Nana Wusu because this Brown team, they lost Kimo Ferrari, who went to San Diego State. I mean, really, like that's a team that like they have a really good 1-2 punch in Nana and then Keno Lilly as well, who is an absolutely dynamite scorer. So to put into perspective, losing a guy like that, who's a really good rebounder, who's just a really big presence on both in the paint on both ends of the court. Brown, who was the 4 seed last year, how much does that cause them to tumble with an injury to come? It was announced what, a week and a half ago. We're less than 3 weeks till the season now. Just how big of a loss that is for Brown that could potentially open a playoff spot for somebody else.
So I got to be careful because when I tweeted out the Haslametrics projections that had Brown near the out of the Ivy tournament, Keno Lilly's dad got pissed at me and was in my mentions. So I got to put all this with a grain of salt and say this is not an indictment of Keno Lilly. He's a beast. But you look at the Brown roster. I mean, there's just nothing really proven in the front court outside of Aaron Cooley, who can operate as a solid three, as a solid swing man. So, I mean, you have Landon Lewis, who probably steps into either the 4 or 5 starting job. He at least has some rotational experience. But after that, I mean, you have a freshman, Wyatt DeGraff, who, again, Ivy League bigs generally take some time to develop. It's rare you have a guy like an AJ Broder or Caden Pierce who can just step in immediately. You have Drew Kania, Simeon the Teotu, and Nafamar Dabo, who did not have any rotational time. So look, I mean, one of these guys can step up and can step up out of the blue. I'm not going to doubt it. I mean, take Xavier Lee. Xavier Lee was not much of a contributor to Princeton as a freshman. I mean, he got very limited minutes. I remember he struggled against Arizona in the NCAA tournament, I think, in his limited minutes, and didn't really play that much the rest of the way. And he makes this insane leap as a sophomore. We're talking about him getting drafted. So this isn't to say that one of those guys can't step up. It's just you're looking at a black box right now. I think also what really hurts Brown, this has kind of gone underreported, is that they had a D2 transfer, Jacob Dar, a 6'7" guy who could add some length similar to Ethan Roberts. And there must have been some sort of admissions issue because he had to withdraw, pull out, decommit, and he's at Rice now. And so losing him, I mean, that was a guy they probably expected to step in and contribute immediately. That's just one less tool that Mike Martin has at his disposal. But look, I mean, they have the guy in Keno who's probably second, third best odds, I'd say, to win Player of the Year. Penn got Jordan Ing was able to drag Penn single-handedly in 2021-22 to the Ivy tournament, basically. I wouldn't really put it past Keno going supernova and dragging them in despite the lack of a proven front court.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, we're winding down here a little bit, so we got to get into prediction time. Ian, we are very, very excited to hear what you have to say about what's going to happen this year in the Ivy League. Of course, you are not a Nostradamus, so things may change, but I think if anyone would know, it would be you. So, your predictions for the Ivy League tournament, um, Coach of the Year, Team of the Year, Player of the Year, all that fun stuff. What do you got for us?
All right, I'm going to go Princeton 1, Yale 2, then I'm going to go little out of the box. I'm going to go Penn 3, the Columbia 3, Penn 4. I really do think that Columbia is going to make it this year, and I think that Penn is just enough to get in. I'll put Cornell 5, Brown 6, Harvard 7, Dartmouth 8th. Coach of the Year, I'm going to say Jim Engels, who I think is probably going to save his job by getting this team into the Ivy tournament. Player of the Year, I'm not going to pick against Xavier. I'm not going to pick against Xavier Lee. I think he's going to have a huge year and probably parlay that into a high second round pick. Newcomer of the Year, Ethan. I think he's going to be the newcomer of the year. And then if we're going to talk Rookie of the Year, the guys at San would be Levine would be one. I think Malik Abdullahi from Princeton, I think is going to be. I mean, look, we can get a little bit into Princeton's depth. I think he's someone who can have a pretty big role at the outset because so many of Prince's depth pieces have transferred out. And Robert Hinton from Harvard, another guy who operates kind of as a three, probably the guy with the best recruiting pedigree in the league. He has a decent shot as well. So I'll just say gun to my head, I'll put Abdullahi as my Rookie of the Year favorite.
Okay, okay. Go to Joseph.
So yeah, I want to rebuttal that, and I also want to add in who I think the first team is going to be because I think this is a pretty crystal clear like all Ivy first team, Ian. And I think you have to throw in. So first of all, Princeton and Yale are going to make up four of the five, and then I think your other five there is Keno Lilly. So I think like I been seeing predictions and stuff, and I just don't know. Somebody would have to really explode somewhere. Now I think if Columbia gets in. Geronimo Rubio De La Rosa could get into that first team potentially. But like first team this year, I look at Caden Pierce, I look at Xavier Lee, I look at Bez Mbeng, I look at John Paul Kiedis, and then I look at Keno Lilly, and I think that is like a almost set it and forget it first team all Ivy League team with how good those guys are returning. Four of which are going to be on two of the best teams that are going to contend for, as you said, Princeton, maybe an at-large. They got a pretty tough schedule, if I remember correctly. Playing Rutgers, they got Loyola Chicago at home, Iona at home. Who else are they going to play? Somebody I'm forgetting.
They got St. Joe's. They're
I was about
going
to say they got
to
to play St.
St. Joe's.
Joe's.
they're going to
Yes.
Hagen again.
Yeah. So I think Cornell could actually be that four or three, excuse me. Like I still think Cornell can stick around, but Columbia, like they are bringing back a lot, and they really were close. I mean, they had a really hot start to Ivy League play that they could have been in their home gym and they could have played there. So it's tough. I still think I like Penn to be four. I think maybe I'd maybe flip flop Columbia and Cornell in your rankings, but I certainly see it with Columbia. And as much as I would say James Jones and Mitch Henderson to be coach of the year, like Jim Engels gets it if they get in. I think if they get into the Ivy League tournament, that's Jim Engels' award. Now, defensive player of the year, Bez Mbang's going to go for three in a row. Nobody's going to, I don't think there's anybody that can remotely stop this guy from winning a third straight Ivy League Defensive Player of the Year. And then, as much as I want to say Xavier Lee, I do think Caden Pierce can go back to back. You can't go wrong with either of them. You really can't go wrong with either of them. So I think Caden Pierce will win it, but you can't go wrong. I mean, I think Xavier Lee is the better chance of getting drafted, but I think Caden Pierce could actually be a pretty useful piece potentially as a second round pick or an undrafted player as well. But agree with all of what you just said, basically. Couple tweaks, but I think you can't go wrong, especially with the top two in this league and player of the year. And then even coach of the year, could potentially flip-flop between James Jones and Mitch Henderson, depending on who maybe gets the one. If Yale is able to get the one seed this year, it could switch. But Ivy League, and I'm sure you can attest to Ian, last 3 years really been very strong. Last year, the top three in the league was extremely strong. I mean, a team in the Sweet 16, a team that beat Auburn, like it really is a very good league. And if you look at Ken Pom and some of the metrics, like it's a league that's in that not even really top half, but really like top third of conferences in terms of power rankings and stuff like that. So really, really good year ahead for the Ivy League. We'll have to see at the Palestra for a game. I used to work at Penn, so I used to go to every single game the last couple of years. But yeah, all good stuff. One more thing for Ian. So at night, you're the Ivy Hoops Online guy covering Penn and covering the Ivy
Yeah.
League. But during the day, you work for CityWire. Like, what is your day job?
So my day job is, so I traded in sports reporting for business reporting when I was finishing up grad school. And so CityWire, we're a website that writes about the wealth management industry, the financial advice business. And so it's really cool. I mean, I've been working there since 2018. I've been the editor since a little bit more than a year and a half now. And so I've been able to break a lot of really, really, really big stories there, which is cool. I mean, it's nice to wake up in the morning and see that we broke a story, and then you got Bloomberg, Reuters, Financial Times, all the big business outlets crediting us. So it's an incredible, I treat breaking stories like a sport there, and I get a lot of satisfaction out of it. There's some very odd times where the two things kind of cross-pollinate. So, for example, Max Martz, good player on Penn, had to medically retire. He now works as an advisor at one of the companies that I write about. There's also been people that I'll write about that I asked, hey, my son plays. Can you get me in front of Coach Donahue? And I'm like, that's not what that I can't promise. I can't promise that. So it's a great job. I definitely like that. That doing sports is a little bit of a hobby, but the two things both fulfill me in different ways.
Bravo. That's awesome. Good for you, man. Um, that's a hell of a crossover though between what you're doing there and the Ivy League hoops. But hey, It works, and I love it. And one more stat for you, real quick, Cope. I know you're mentioning how Ivy League is going to be in like the top third or half. They're currently projected at 14th on Ken Palm out of 31 conferences. So, pretty good league. Pretty good league for basketball. We're very excited to watch it this year. And if you need coverage of it, Ian Wenik's got you covered. Ian, thank you so much for coming on the pod, talk about Penn and the Ivy League this year. We're very much excited for Penn to hopefully get back into that top four, get back in the Ivy League tournament this year and make a run at the NCAA tournament. But thank you again for coming on and sharing with us your thoughts on the league this year.
Thanks for having me on, guys, and I'll see you in Philly.
We will see you in Philly. And thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you go follow Ivy Hoops. Is that right? Ivy Hoops. I had it up a second ago. Ivy Hoops Online. Wanted to get it right for the people. Make sure you go follow Ian Wenik, Ivy Hoops Online. You know us though. Kyle Morello, Jake Copestick for the Big Five Pod. We'll see you guys next time.